Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. We had a little bit of a technical issue, but I think that is being solved as we speak here. We're so happy that all of you have chosen to spend the afternoon here with us at Grants Pass Seventh-day Adventist Church, and in particular with Dr. Neil Nedley. I'm excited that he's here. I was excited before this morning's presentation, and you know what? I'm even more excited right now because I found this morning's presentation to be absolutely awesome. And I don't say that in any kind of lighthearted way or half-heartedly, I guess I should say. It really was awesome, at least for me. I felt that Dr. Nedley was speaking directly to me personally. There was a message that I needed to hear this morning that I still need to hear in terms of emotional intelligence. We're blessed this afternoon and again tomorrow morning that Dr. Neil Nedley is going to be speaking. This afternoon, his topic is about optimizing our brains. You know, it probably goes without saying, but there's a lot of our spiritual life that has to do with the health of our brains and our mental health and well-being. If our mental health is not right, probably our spiritual life is not going to be right either. So I think this is a particularly important message for those of us who care about having a healthy spiritual life. We are going to go ahead and get started with some music, and then Dr. Neil Nedley will be speaking right after the music. Thank you again for being here. You know what, it just occurred to me, I hate to cut off music, but I was so excited to have Dr. Neil Nedley speak that I forgot that one of the most important things for us to do as Christians is to pray. So let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer. Our loving Father in heaven, we thank you so much that we can address you as our Father, and that you're not just any Father, but that you truly are our loving Father. Lord, we're so thankful that we can be here on this Sabbath day to just be with you, to learn more about how fearfully and wonderfully our bodies are made and our minds. You have truly made us and created us in an awesome way. And as we gather here together, I just pray that you would teach us something important about who we are and how you have made us in such a fearful and wonderful way. And Lord, I pray that during this presentation that each one of us could take home at least one important take-home lesson, something that we can and will apply to our lives to be better people, to be more kind and thoughtful with those around us. And Lord, I just pray that for each one here today, that we truly would be transformed and blessed in a way that's beyond our wildest dreams. Thank you that Dr. Nedley is here today, and I just pray that you would anoint him with your words to speak. Lord, even if he has a different message in mind this afternoon than what you have in mind, switch that all around so that the message that comes out is your message for us. Thank you, Lord, for these blessings and your love. And we pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Shackled by a heavy burden, 'neath a load of guilt and shame, then the hand of Jesus touched me. And now I am no longer the same. He touched me. Oh, he touched me. And oh, the joy that floods my soul. Something happened, and now I know he touched me and made me whole. Since I met this blessed Savior, since he's cleansed and made me whole, oh, I will never cease to praise him. I'll shout it while eternity rolls. Oh, he touched me. Oh, he touched me. He touched me. And oh, the joy that floods my soul. Something
Well, it's good to be here again this afternoon. And today we're going to be talking about optimizing your brain. This is actually a subject matter that we teach in a college course at Weimar. One of the general education requirements for anyone that gets a degree at Weimar is to take Optimize Your Brain, and normally it's a freshman class. So we have a lot of freshmen at Weimar, and in fact, on this Wednesday, they're taking their final exam, Optimize Your Brain. But half of their grade is actually not based on exams or quizzes or things like that. It's based on actually participating in the habits on a regular basis that will optimize their brain. And of course, this is important at the beginning of their college careers to have enough intelligence to be able to learn, retain, and apply knowledge, as well as enough emotional intelligence as well. Interestingly, yesterday at the meeting of the presidents of the universities in California, I was mentioning what we do at Weimar, and they were all very interested in the course, the Optimize Your Brain, because they also go through a screening test. They actually take a test at the beginning to see what their emotional intelligence is. We're able to identify whether they have depression, whether they have anxiety, and those type of things, and be able to offer resources to those that have mental health challenges. Fortunately, at Weimar, we're not at the 60% of college students that have a mental illness. I think, and it's not zero, but I think among this freshman class, if I'm remembering correctly, it's actually 10%. And so far different than it is at UCSF or even Stanford or those places. But still, we want those 10% to be able to be helped. And of course, the 90% need to improve their IQ and EQ, which the program will do. So there's multiple things they learn in regards to optimizing their brain. But I'll start out with a text that is actually the last chapter in the Bible that says, "And they shall see his face, and his name shall be" where? In their foreheads. Now, what's there in the forehead? The brain, and particularly what portion of the brain? The frontal lobe. And this is where IQ and EQ come together. According to results of a study that followed thousands of students through their college careers, the higher education system is effectively broken. By the way, this is the higher education system. For those of you that are educators, this is the college and universities. The highest form of higher education, or it's considered the highest form, is called regional accreditation. And by the way, regional accreditation is going to be no more in another year. Regional means that that they just accredit in a certain region. For instance, you can't utilize our accrediting body up here in Oregon. It's only California that has the WASC, and of course California prides themselves, and I actually think they may be right about this, because we are accredited by them, but they pride themselves as having the best accrediting university system in America. But in 2020, as a result of what the Department of Education is doing at the federal government, they're getting rid of the regional part. So in other words, in 2020, an Oregon university might be able to select the accrediting body in California to accredit their university. And this is now going to be competition. Before, they all had a monopoly. In their region. There was only one regional accreditor, and you went to that one regional accreditor to get it done, but now there's going to be selectivity going on. But of course, Stanford is accredited, as I mentioned, by this regional accrediting body, and others are as well. But interestingly, the results show that many students are leaving college with degrees, but little to no improvement in critical thinking or complex reasoning skills. And of course, you're thinking that's why they're coming. This is why they should be coming to an accredited university. But we're finding out they're getting degrees, but their brains are actually not improving. Their ability to analyze things are not improving. Their complex reasoning skills are not improving. And of course, this is quite new because prior to this, colleges and universities seem to be able to greatly enhance this. This was a study of 2,322 typically aged college students, found that a whopping 45% showed no improvement in higher reasoning and critical thinking skills after 2 years. After 4 years, 36% managed to get a 4-year degree with no improvement whatsoever from the time they were in high school in their complex reasoning or critical thinking skills. Now, let me ask you a question. If those people did not go to one of these high-end universities and instead had to work every day on a farm in 3 dimensions with their hands, do you think their complex reasoning skills would have improved? Actually, far greater likelihood. And so we're kind of in a dilemma situation where the brains actually develop better in some cases when you don't go to any colleges and universities. And you actually, do things out in nature and work with your hands and those type of things. Why is it improving with that? Well, the frontal lobe actually continues to develop for 30 years. So if we're giving it the right nutrition, so to speak, the right environment for it to grow, we ought to be able to significantly improve in complex reasoning skills and critical thinking from age 18 to 22. Now, I don't know if any of those other college presidents that I met with yesterday would tell you what I just told you here today. It seems self-defeating, when you're ahead of a university to say that you might do better not going to that university and actually working with your hands outdoors. But we are in that dilemma today. The study also found that although more selective schools had higher overall success, all 24 universities involved had small groups of presumably self-motivated kids who were learning a lot among a majority who were just getting by. So some of them were actually doing very well. The most successful students tended to do what? Work on their own rather than studying or working in groups. Now, this is something that also really baffles the accrediting bodies because the accrediting bodies love to see students work in groups and have all of these group activities and group sessions and those sorts of things. But they found out those who were actually more of the loner types did better as far as their overall critical thinking. While one aspect of this could have to do with self-motivation or simply study habits, another reason that surfaces is that these students don't like to group up because the majority of those groups are kids from the 45% who still haven't grasped critical thinking. In other words, it puts them behind and it's kind of waste their time to get involved in these group activities when they're not really enhancing as a result. Many graduates, yes, people who graduated, had trouble sifting fact from fiction. Sorry about the technology there, but that's we had to change things from PowerPoint to Keynote. And as you can see, the fonts didn't quite come out there, but hopefully you can hear the message. If you take a look at what they were measuring as far as complex reasoning skills, this isn't rocket science. They're actually measuring their ability to sift fact from fiction. They're measuring their ability to address subjects objectively. They're measuring their ability to reconcile and analyze conflicting reports of a single event. And they are asking graduates to make decisions and arguments based on what? Facts and logic without being affected by appeals to emotion or political spin. But it turns out our students can't do that as far as nationwide. they're having lots of trouble being able to do this sort of thing. In short, these are things we would tend to ask from functional citizens, whether they have a degree in art, history, biochemistry, or nothing at all, but they could not be performed by a large percentage of college graduates from prestigious universities. And the author of this study, that comes from one of these prestigious universities, has written a book called Academically Adrift: Limited Learning on College Campuses. And it has produced some waves in the academic world because it's helping people and helping accrediting bodies to realize, with all of their criteria for accreditation, those criteria are not necessarily helping the brains of the students by going there. And of course, one of the primary reasons why they are not helping the brain has to do with the fact that a lot of their learning is not enhancing the front part of the brain. The front part of the brain is where creativity is going to occur. It's where thinking outside the box is going to occur, and those type of things. And it's also, although all aspects of the brain are involved in intelligence, it's also where intelligence is centered. So what is intelligence? It's your capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. And it sounds pretty simple, but of course it can be involved. It's often measured by an IQ test, but IQ tests are known to be inaccurate, and about 20% of individuals will greatly overestimate some people's IQ who are good test takers, and it will greatly underestimate other people's IQs who are not necessarily good test takers. IQ has been shown to be related somewhat to academic performance. However, EQ is more related to academic performance because of the motivation part. You know, you can have someone with an average IQ who's really motivated and they'll study hard, and they may get a 4.0, and someone where learning comes easy to them is not motivated and their grades are not so good. So IQ is related to academic performance, but it's not as related. College graduates' first job, however, after graduation has been found to be related to their IQ. And this is one of the reasons why I've given Optimize Your Brain seminars in different places in the country. And normally, the typical people who come are those who have high school age students, and they're coming and making sure these high school age students sit on the front row of this Optimize Your Brain program, because they're wanting those kids to optimize their brain so that they can get into these Ivy League schools and be able to successfully complete an Ivy League degree, because the studies show that they're much more likely to get a six-figure income right out of college if they are able to get into the right school and get the right degree and those sorts of things. But interestingly, the studies show that once you get your first job, your promotions in that job are no longer related to your IQ. They're actually related to your EQ. That's what Christy found. For those of you that were here this morning, I talked about Christy, who was having problems in her job performance and a lot of issues there. And after the program, and when she came back to successfully complete it, because she had only done the 3-day program on the first round, after successfully completing that, she kept getting offers for higher jobs, not even applying for them, but people were noticing the improved emotional intelligence, and you should be actually the manager of our unit, and so she was being asked for leadership positions because of this emotional intelligence. A lot of students, though, when they're being passed up, they've done well in school and they've gotten 4.0s and those sorts of things, and they come to our program and they haven't done well. Sometimes I'll ask them, why is it that you think you've been passed over for promotions? And they often tell me it's because my boss does not have a high enough IQ to recognize my IQ. And that's actually not the reason. They learn that by the time we go further, but it's because their boss is recognizing their lack of EQ that's the issue, and that's why they're being passed over for promotion. But there are advantages of higher intelligence. We shouldn't underestimate it. You're more efficient in studying. Is that a good thing? Yeah, because you can go to a very difficult school and still get exercise and still get enough sleep and still have a devotional life. By the way, those are three things that we look at all the time. If your life is in balance, you ought to be able to have a regular exercise program. You ought to be able to have a regular devotional life, and you ought to be able to get adequate sleep, even, Sunday through Friday and not just on weekends. And if you're having to catch up on weekends, it's a sign of imbalance somewhere. And so, and of course, if you have a high enough IQ, you can live a balanced life in regards to this. In fact, it reminds me a little bit of I'm getting ahead of myself here, but one of our speakers at our EQ Summit coming up is become very famous because he is a Generation Z guy who is a multimillionaire, and he makes his money actually computer programming, so he's a computer guru, but he spends 0 time on entertainment TV, 0 time on entertainment internet, and he's never had a social media account. He actually refuses to have a social media account. And he is sought after the world over because of his brain's abilities in computer programming and being able to solve complex computer-related issues, which he realizes related very much to the lifestyle he chose to never have a social media account. And so he's very much into optimizing your brain, but he talks about how as a multimillionaire and making over $1 million a year, I still sleep well every night, I still have a balanced life, I still have time for this, I still have time for all of that. But one of the reasons is because he doesn't do anything in regards to his regular schedule to suppress his frontal lobe, and that's why he's able to have all this extra time in regards to living a balanced life. And he says some people will say, well then, how are people going to know about you if you're not on social media? And he says, if you are at the top of the field, they will find you. And he says they're going to find you. And it was difficult for me to actually locate, to be able to communicate with him, for him to come to our EQ Summit. Because, we couldn't contact him in the normal computer ways. But when you're very good, people will find a way of reaching you and finding a way to contact you. But this is one of the advantages, of course, of higher intelligence. You're more efficient in studying, you're more creative, you're more logical, you're more persuasive, your influence goes up. You're more likely to become wealthy. And if wealth is a high priority for someone with high IQ, they will become wealthy, as we'll talk about. But for many people with high IQ, wealth isn't even on the top 10 priority list. So there's a lot of people with high IQ that are not wealthy. Another advantage is health-wise. This was a study by Harvard University. Large study over many, many years showed that up to the cutoff point of 163, this is on IQ. Does anyone know what the average IQ is? It's 100. Every 10 points is a standard deviation, so 163 is an extremely high IQ. That's way up at the very top. Participants' risk of dying during a given period decreased as their IQ increased. In fact, those with a childhood IQ of 150 had a 44% lower risk of death than those with an IQ of 135. And so IQ actually increases your longevity. Now, at the time that Harvard study was published, let me go back to it. Harvard study was published in 2005 there. They didn't know why. They were saying, this is new. IQ is a variable for longevity and how long you're going to live. And they were wondering, why is that a variable for longevity? Now, it turns out after this, we discovered it, one of the reasons, a couple of the reasons, and we'll go into this here in a little bit. But of course, there's more lobes of the brain. There's the temporal lobe. This is actually where memory is stored. And this is an important part. Now, your working memory, and this is something we'll hopefully have time to get into this a little bit more this afternoon. Your working memory is what you are learning and what you're able to keep in mind for about 30 seconds to a minute. And if you are engaged enough, or if it's interesting enough, or you're intentional enough, that's when it can get then transferred over to the temporal lobe to be stored. I can tell you a lot of our young people today are having problems with their working memory. The working memory is actually in the frontal lobe of the brain. It's the anterior cingulate gyrus of the frontal lobe of the brain. And one of the primary reasons why we're seeing this anterior cingulate gyrus not being able to work very well in working memory, anyone want to guess what the reason for it is? It's particularly declined after 2007. What happened in 2007? The invention of the smartphone. And what is happening among our young people with smartphones is they get on their smartphone to do something useful, but within 90 seconds to at most 5 minutes, they're no longer doing anything useful. Why not? Because somebody did a Snapchat. There was an email notification from somebody. And then there's a news flash that Donald Trump said something about another woman, and they have to check it out. And so they're driven to distraction. These devices are very distracting. And of course, the engineers that are engineering all of this are actually designing you to get distracted. In fact, they're all trying to gear up to be the most distractible thing that comes across your screen. And then they actually try to find out more about you. Do you like BMWs? If so, within 5 minutes, there's going to be something about a BMW flash that goes across quickly so that you can click on that and get distracted about that. And so, as a result, this anterior cingulate gyrus that never has to focus on anything for very long begins to shrink. And we'll actually see it in the MRIs. It shrinks down. And this is why in the present generation, if there's something even highly interesting that is more than about 5 minutes on a YouTube video, there's no way that younger generation's going to watch it because they realize they don't have the anterior cingulate gyrus to actually process this for very long. They can only do very short snippets. And this is something that is, of course, very concerning. This is why learning is the ability to learn. You know, and there's also something called a Google effect that a lot of people have today. The Google effect is this: we don't have to remember anything. Because if I need to know something, what will I do? I will Google it. I will look it up. But the art of remembering is the art of thinking. And, you know, when I grew up, of course, there was none of these devices, and I had well over 1,000 phone numbers memorized. You know, I knew at the hospital what, you know, the numbers were for each of the floors, for the ICU, for ER. I knew, of course, my parents' numbers. I knew my friends' numbers. I knew a lot of my faculty members' numbers, and I would never have to look up their numbers because I had associated those numbers. And, of course, this is one of the reasons as well our students are excelling at Weimar Institute. I won't give names, but we've had many individuals that have taken the science portion of their MCAT and DAT, this is the entrance to medical school and dental school, and they have not missed a single scientific question. Got all of them perfect. Now, what is the reason? How are we teaching them in this way? What happens, and the one who teaches more of the science classes that is on this is Dr. Harris, who's a brilliant chemist and also a biochemist. She actually worked for the pharmaceutical industry as well before she came, so she's a very highly successful chemist and well-touted, has impeccable references. But actually, this is another story in and of itself. As a result of her biochemistry studies, she began to realize that there had to be design in creation. She was taught in the evolutionary theory, but she realized, wait a minute, this biochemical pathway could not have come first and then this one. There had to be several of these all together in design format, otherwise it would have never been able to occur. And she began to recognize there was a designer and things like that, and it finally led her to the Bible, and then led her to want to teach at an institute at Weimar. In fact, people wonder, do you have academic freedom at Weimar? You know, what about academic freedom? She says, I have much more academic freedom at Weimar than I did at the University of Colorado, because she's able to actually teach out of, you know, the truths of both things. But what she will do is she will teach an organic chemistry concept, and she will parallel that with a biblical concept. And so the students, when they come to an MCAT exam, they're always teaching them, or not teaching them, they're always giving them new problems that they've never seen before. Why are they doing that? They're wanting to see if they can think. They're wanting to see if their frontal lobe and their judgment and wisdom are enough to be able to get into medical school, because you don't want to make mistakes in judgment when you're a doctor. And so with these new problems, the typical student will see that and say, there's no way. I've never seen this problem. I don't think I was taught this at all. And our students have that same mindset when they see a new problem. It's like, whoa, I'm not prepared for this. But then they'll look at the problem a little more closely, and what do you think they remember first? They remember the biblical concept. Then they'll remember the organic chemistry concept, and then they'll solve the problem. Why? Because of this association. It's far easier to remember two things and associate it than it is to remember one isolated thing that's out there. And this is one of the reasons why learning has become such a challenge, because of this whole Google effect. We're not having to associate things together, and if we are not able to associate things, we're not going to be able to have things in memory in our temporal lobe long term to be able to retrieve them. And so the advent of all of these smartphones has actually created an enigma that a lot of the scientists are talking about, because the current generation actually has more arrogance in regards to what they think they know. But that we're actually find out they're the most gullible generation. They're able to be easily manipulated and fooled because their brains are not stocked with things that they know are absolute truth. And so when they hear something like this, even though it makes zero sense at all, because their memories aren't stocked with these facts that are true, they all of a sudden latch onto something that is completely untrue and will get emotionally attached to that, and then there's all sorts of problems that result as being the most gullible. And this is something that's being talked about. I mean, you can research this out, and this is something that our expert also is going to be talking about at the EQ Summit. Occipital lobe. This is where our vision is centered, and it's also where visual orientation is centered. IQ is based on some of those things, our architectural skills, our ability to design has to do with occipital lobe. Parietal lobe is where language is at. When you're learning a new language, your parietal lobe is being expanded. But also calculation, division, subtraction, math skills are there in the parietal lobe. Einstein, when he gave his brain to science, was found to have a little larger parietal lobe than most others. Cerebellum is where our coordination is centered. And when teams get together to compete, they're actually determining which team has the most corporately developed cerebellum, or at least the one that's functioning best that day. They don't realize that's what they're doing. but that's precisely what they're doing. And then the frontal lobe is where, as mentioned, EQ and IQ go together. In regards to our brains, of course, other creatures have brains as well. A cat, I didn't realize how small a cat brain was till I was in high school biology and dissected a cat. And the last thing we got into was the brain. And it's not a very large brain, but what I didn't realize, because I didn't know all the lobes at that time, that only 3.5% of a cat brain is in the frontal lobe. What does that mean? Not much morality in a cat. If you've seen the cat torture a victim to death and actually enjoy the process. You know, anyone who enjoys torture, it's a sign of serious frontal lobe compromise, and the cat thoroughly enjoys torturing that mouse to death, and it's kind of shocking to see it, but that's because of that low frontal lobe ability. Dogs have a little more frontal lobe, 7.5% of their brain is in the frontal lobe. And that's what gives dogs the ability to actually empathize more. I don't know if you've noticed it or not, but your cat doesn't really care whether you're home or not. But your dog is actually very happy to see you and happy to reestablish that relationship with you when you come home because of that larger frontal lobe. They will also have, they don't enjoy torture. Now, they're not the most moral creatures. They will murder if they have to, but they do it much more mercifully. They're not into torture, and also they're able to. You know, I just came back from Africa a few weeks ago and was out there in the Serengeti, and the tour guides were telling us the difference between the cat brain and the dog brain in regards to their preys out there, because there are wild dogs and all sorts of different breeds that are out there in Africa. But they said the cat, it just has one plan. And if it doesn't catch up to its prey in 90 seconds, it's done. It just goes from point A to point B. But with the dogs, they'll actually plan. They'll actually get together, and without corresponding at all, they know that they're going to chase the prey over to this direction, then this group will come in and do it over here, and they're 3 or 4 steps ahead, and they're of course, that's the frontal lobe, that ability to accomplish that advanced planning and thinking. Chimpanzees have the most of any other animal creature. 17% of their brain is in the frontal lobe. But what sets us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom is our frontal lobe size. 33 up to 38% of the human brain is in the frontal lobe. And that's what gives us the ability to accomplish advanced planning and thinking. This is a quote from Guyton's textbook of physiology that's used in medical schools throughout the country. Scientific studies show the frontal lobe is the seat of spirituality, morality, and also the will. And so this is where willpower, our ability to have self-control, is centered here in the frontal lobe of the brain. And when the frontal lobe is compromised, we will see a number of effects. Moral principle goes down. If we want to follow the decline of morality in an individual or in society, the answer is going to be in the frontal lobe. Social impairment occurs. It's natural to love family members, but when that natural love for family goes away, it's often due to frontal lobe compromise. Lack of foresight, our ability to reason from cause to effect, is a frontal lobe phenomena. You can even follow your child's frontal lobe development by how far they're planning for in the future. Abstract reasoning is impaired when the frontal lobe goes down. Our ability to interpret proverbs goes down. Mathematical understanding is diminished. Now, I talked about calculation, division being parietal lobe, but higher forms of math, calculus, and higher forms of algebra require the frontal lobe. By the way, calculus is one of those subjects taught at Weimar Institute because we're also very much a research institute. By the way, Weimar not only became accredited, but just a few months ago, we have our own institutional research board. So this is where we can conduct the very high-end studies that get published in major publications, and many of our students and professors are published on a regular basis in peer-reviewed journals and are asked to speak at conferences. 4 of our students last year were asked to speak at Harvard University and went out and spoke at Harvard in regards to some of the studies that are going on there. But of course, in order to do studies on the high-end aspect of things, that's where math comes in. People wonder, what's the application of math? Well, if you want to speak in today's language and research, it has to come down to measurements and statistics. And of course, calculus puts you on a higher playing field in regards to that. But calculus does require the frontal lobe. You've got to, it's not just, calculation division, which would be parietal lobe functions. Loss of empathy will go down. When the frontal lobe goes down, our ability to understand what someone else is going through goes down. And studies show if you have a well-functioning frontal lobe, you can just hear about what happened to her, and you will feel precisely the same feelings. You don't have to have gone through what she's gone through to be able to feel precisely the same feelings. Now, that's true if you don't have a good frontal lobe. There's no way you're going to be able to empathize because you can't identify with it. But that's one of the advantages of that good frontal lobe. Lack of restraint tends to occur. Boasting, hostility, anger, rage, emotions that are out of control also occur. And then there are character strengths that actually go up when the frontal lobe is enhanced. One of those is creativity, and there's 2 essential components for this, being original, meaning that nobody has thought of this before, but also adaptive, meaning that your originality makes a positive contribution to the life of others. There's some people I know in today's world that pride themselves of being very creative, but in reality, they're just very bizarre. In other words, they haven't done anything that's useful with their creativity to enhance the lives of others. In order to have true creativity, you need to have both of those things. And that underscores, again, why people who have higher intelligence, because this is part of intelligence, your creativity part, can go from the lowest echelon status in the economy to the highest in a matter of a few years, because once they come up with something that's original and useful to others, and if it's useful to a lot of others, they can put that into manufacturing, into practice, and they can, of course, turn that into wealth. Interest also goes up in the frontal lobe. Have you noticed the younger generation, if you take their phones away from them, it's like, I'm going to be bored now. What am I going to do without my phone? This is actually a sign of significant frontal lobe compromise, because if you don't have a phone or something to distract you, if you have a good frontal lobe, you're going to be interested in everything, and it's fun to interact with someone who's intrigued by everything. And as this book, secular book, Character, Strengths, and Virtue, says, if curiosity can be cultivated, which it can be by enhancing the frontal lobe, no one need ever search for interesting experiences. One will simply have them. And so you can take some young person with a very good frontal lobe and band them to this room for hours, and at first they might be disappointed. Why is it that I'm being banned to this room? But by the time you would find them and tell them it's okay to leave the room, they're not sure they want to leave because they would be studying something that's highly interesting to them. So people with good frontal lobes, they are enjoyable to be around for that reason. And then judgment goes up. Your critical thinking, rationality, which is what we've been talking about. And of course, it feels good. It leads to good decisions, also leads to a coherent view of the world. Love of learning also goes up considerably. And then wisdom. What is that? It's the comprehension of what is true or right, coupled with what? Optimum judgment as to action. You might know something that's true and right, but if you're not coupling it with optimal judgment in regards to wise action, then of course that's not wisdom. Kindness and empathy go up. Social intelligence also goes up considerably. So there are a number of ways in which we can, I can see I'm on Keynote here. Let's see. Yeah, difference between PowerPoint and Keynote is Keynote will back up the slide all the way, and PowerPoint will just back it up 1 point. So I need to go through all this again. There are ways in which we can suppress our frontal lobe. And one of those ways to suppress it is drugs. Whether it's heroin, whether it's opioids, whether it's meth, whether it's cocaine, all of these recreational drugs by design suppress the frontal lobe of the brain. That's one of the reasons why people like to use them. It can actually feel good to have your limbic system take over your judgment at first. And it is, of course, this is why marijuana has significantly increased as well. Marijuana is a powerful frontal lobe suppressant. These drugs, and of course, it's kind of baffling to hear the rationality behind marijuana. I know Oregon is a big marijuana grower, and I know Northern California is a big marijuana grower as well. And it is, the rationale for it. And of course, if you get online, you might think it might cure every disease known to mankind now, because it's used for all sorts of different disease treatments. But there are disease treatments in 99% of cases that are far better without the risks of frontal lobe suppression. But there's no fascination in regards to the things that are only beneficial and have no risk. You don't hear the write-ups about that. So the world is fascinated with things that might have some benefit, but then there's that risk or that hook that's on there. And of course, with marijuana, that hook, anything that's a frontal lobe suppressant actually does have a hook. And so it ends up decreasing your motivation for just about everything else in life except for where you're going to get your next marijuana from. And it increases your motivation that way. In fact, we have a lot of marijuana users come through our program, and one of the characteristic elements of the typical marijuana user is they will tell me, I have no self-control whatsoever. And what I have to teach them is everybody actually does have selective self-control. And they'll say, I have no self-control. But then I talk to them, and they're very careful about the soil that their marijuana is in. They make sure it's watered on time. They much do have meticulous self-control in regards to their marijuana. But the other aspects of their life, they don't have that control over. And then there are prescription drugs that impair the frontal lobe. This is why we have to weigh the benefits versus the risk. One of those I discussed with a number of people today that are on the benzodiazepines. I mentioned this with Christie's case, and so that triggered some people to come forward and talk to me about their lorazepam or other things that they're on. And these benzos actually were only meant to be utilized and designed for short-term acute panic or acute types of very uncontrollable situations. But when they're used on a regular basis, they actually will decrease your ability to even make GABA-aminobutyric acid in your brain. And that's what we need in order to be able to manage our emotions when there's stressful situations going on. And they're also powerful frontal lobe suppressants. Many people in the medical world talk about alcohol in a pill, essentially, in regards to these things. And the world doesn't necessarily know how to get you off them. In fact, if I were in charge of the FDA, which I'm not looking for that job, so don't call the FDA to try to get me in charge of it. But if I were in charge of the FDA, I would not allow any physician to prescribe benzos. Because the typical physician, actually, believe it or not, psychiatrists are far more wise in prescribing benzos than non-psychiatrists are. Because psychiatrists know about that hook. But the family practice doctor, when they see someone with anxiety, they know that as soon as they start taking this benzo, they're going to feel at peace with the world, and they're going to say, I finally realized my problem. I had a Xanax deficiency. and they're at peace with the world for a while, but then that tolerance develops, and of course that filling the GABA receptors, and now the GABA goes down, and after 30 days, if they try to stop their Xanax, they have tenfold the anxiety of what they had before they ever got on it to begin with. And so it has this tremendous hook. And then the typical doctor will say, don't ever try to get off of that, because you're not going to be able to get off of it. Don't ever try to get off of that. And fortunately, we've actually published that. In fact, we're going through another study, another one to just present it to our IRB in a nice comparative study. But our program is highly successful in getting people to be able to be off of benzos. Just in our last program, we had a lady who was on benzos for 20 plus years. And she particularly began to crater when her husband died just recently. And then she started using alcohol on top of the benzos and all of this sort of thing, and just began to crash. Fortunately, she was part of our at Weimar Institute. This is another thing that's kind of unique. We're the only college we know of that empties out every week on Wednesday at noon, and all of the faculty and students do community service in the community, and they serve the same section of the community, and they get to know all of the people in the community and see what their needs are. And it became very clear that she had significant needs. So first they were helping her yard to clean up, and then they were cleaning her gutters, and then they were doing things to help her with the daily aspects of life, and then they realized there were some deep issues. And so on Wednesday afternoon, I also have a free clinic for TCI people, and so they sent me over there for a house call. And of course, it became very clear at that point with her benzo usage and all of that, that she needed some more thorough work than just one visit would give her. But she began to understand that there was a way out of that. And the Lord opened up the way for her because of donors in the local area that knew about her case to actually send her through our program. And she was very fearful of getting off her benzos. She just says, I'm not going to be able to do this. And I actually first she would switch over to clonazepam, but there's something even longer acting in clonazepam called Valium, and so she was on Valium, and so we were taking it down piece by piece, little by little. And she got to the program and she says, I'm already full of anxiety and I can't go down further more than this. I said, you are on the right dose to get off of this. By day 7, she took her last benzo, and she is off of her benzos. It's been, she went through the October program, so it's been over a month, and she is already full of life. The new Jenny has emerged, and she's got a great sense of humor, and she's managing her emotions, and she is now getting a full-time job, actually, at Weimar Institute. She's going to be working in the Weimar. She's so thrilled to be working there at Weimar in such a supportive environment. But you can get off of these opioids and these benzos. By the way, opioids are even easier to get off of. We had our nurse who works in our clinic, Kelly. She went through our program a year ago, and she was on 400 milligrams of OxyContin a day. For those of you that know opioids, that's a huge amount of narcotics. And it was over $50,000 a year drug habit. She's a girl in her 30s, started out with first alcohol, then marijuana, it goes through all the cycles, and then finally it got to these opioids, and her life was in shambles, relationship in shambles, child out of wedlock, just a life in complete disaster. And she was an LPN, and she decided, I can't live my life this way anymore. And so, and by the way, this is also kind of curious. how did she get on those opioids? She was pregnant with the child out of wedlock, and she had a kidney stone. So she was put in the hospital with a PCA pump, giving herself narcotics with this kidney stone for a week while she's pregnant, and sent home on OxyContin. So that's how she got hooked. And then, of course, she developed that tolerance and all of that sort of thing. And so from 400 of OxyContin, she went down to 0. Now, she went to her grandparents' place. They were the only, her relationship with her parents was terrible. They wouldn't take her in. But her grandmother still loved her and said, I'll take you in. And so they let her be in the house as she got off this 400 of OxyContin. Now, benzos, you don't want to do that, because if you go down from benzos to high dose to 0, you can actually have a seizure. You know, it can be dangerous. This is why even high amounts of alcohol, if you're on high amounts of alcohol for years and you stop it abruptly, delirium tremens. But opioids actually increase your risk of seizures, so when you get off opioids, your risk of seizures is none. And so you don't die from opioid withdrawal. It just produces severe dysphoria, and you can get some physical symptoms of it. She got those physical symptoms of diarrhea, because opioids cause constipation. So when you get off of it and your body's adjusted over to this, you're going to have some significant diarrhea. You're going to have some stomach upset. And by day 3, she had all the symptoms of severe dysphoria as she's trying to do this on her own, and the diarrhea, and she started getting sick and nausea and vomiting. So she went to the ER, and what do you think the ER wanted to do? You're coming off of that much OxyContin, let's give you some IV morphine right now. And she says, no, I don't want that. Don't give me any opioids. So they gave her IV Zofran to help her with her nausea, and they gave her a couple of liters of IV fluids, and she got better. And she didn't have insurance, so they didn't admit her, and she got sent home. And it was a 30-day process for her. She did have chronic pain, but she said after the 30 days, she had no more pain than what she had ever had. But now she was able to manage it, and she had a frontal lobe. But she had another issue behind that. She hadn't come to our program yet. And now that she wasn't self-medicating, the underlying problems of depression started to manifest themselves even more, and she started to get suicidal. And this is why I know there's a God, because of all of these stories we'll have. She was actually going to end her life. She lived in a very busy city, and she was going to run out in traffic. And she was looking for the traffic person, the traffic car that was not going to stop, that was going through the light and jump out in front of them. And she had that look on her face, and one friend who wasn't going so fast went by and recognized her and put her window down and says, "Kelly, are you okay?" And Kelly says, "I'm not okay." She says, "Get into this car." And so she went into the car, and they talked, and says, "Have you ever heard about the Nedley program?" And so she told her grandma about the Nedley program, and the next program, she was in our program. And now she has been narcotic-free since that time, benzo-free, all of this off of drugs, and now she is a vibrant nurse that's helping a lot of others in the outpatient clinic program. But don't think that people can't get off of these drugs. There is a process, but they can get off, but they need to also get to the underlying issues that cause them to self-medicate in these ways in order to have that lasting success. It's not just getting off that we're after, but dealing with those underlying issues. And then alcohol. It's legal, but it does impair the frontal lobe significantly. By the way, speaking of alcohol, if you have a glass of wine with your meal at Olive Garden and you drive home, do you have an increased risk of an accident? You're legal, but your risk of an automobile accident goes up by 40%. Once you get to the legal limit, which in Oregon I believe is 0.08%, you have an 11-fold increased risk of an accident. Now at the legal limit, if a policeman were to pull you over, maybe you're at 0.78%, so you're just legal, would you be able to walk a straight line? You could. You could walk a straight line. You could even, and Miguel Cabrera has demonstrated this, he's a baseball player, you can even hit a curveball out of a baseball park at that level. Your coordination is working great. Your cerebellum is working great. Why is it then that Miguel Cabrera is more than tenfold more likely to get into an auto accident on the way home from that baseball game? Because his judgment's not working. And that's what happened to Princess Di's driver. He attempted a turn at a speed that was impossible to negotiate. No one recognized he was drunk because he was walking normally, conversing normally, but his judgment in taking that turn at that speed in that tunnel, he would have not done had his judgment been okay, and he lost his life. The princess lost her life as well. But in regards to, and by the way, does it take critical thinking to drive an automobile successfully? It actually does not take critical thinking. This is why we allow college students to do it. And high school students that are in their junior and senior year. It takes judgment, but it doesn't take critical thinking. Critical thinking, an example of critical thinking is, some of you realized I got here by private airplane yesterday that I piloted myself. And under instrument conditions, when you can't see and one of your instruments goes bad, particularly if it's something you're not trained for on how it went bad, that requires critical thinking because it's a new problem and you're having to solve that problem in flight. This is what happened to Air France when they were going from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. Those pilots, there were 3 of them, they were in instrument conditions, and one of their instruments went bad. Now, there's only 6 primary instruments to fly an airplane successfully in instrument conditions, and you can do without any one of those, and you can be able to make up the difference with the others. And so when an instrument starts to go bad, you have to figure out which one is it that's going bad. And when their instruments started to go bad, their airspeed indicator started to actually show too high of an airspeed. Now, Airbus, I'm getting into some of the complex things. The difference in Boeing has been trying to catch up to Airbus in some ways, but Airbus trusts the computerized system more than it trusts pilots. Where Boeing, prior to a few years ago, always trusted pilots more than it did computerized systems. Now, there was a reason why both companies took this approach. Airbus took this approach because Airbus is a cheaper aircraft, and so the third world countries, when they had limited resources, they were going to buy Airbus. And they're also pilots were not near as highly trained as our pilots are in the military and all of those sorts of things. And so they always built the computer system to kind of override the pilot. And so when the airspeed indicator was too high, how do you slow down an airplane quickly? It's not flaps. This will do it quicker than flaps. You actually pull up and you put that nose to the sky, and it'll slow down very quickly. And so the nose was put to the sky by the computerized system, and the airspeed went back down. But now they noticed the altitude was losing. 4,000 feet a minute. They're, up there at 38,000 feet, and they're going down 4,000 feet a minute, and their airspeed looks okay. And they know something's wrong. This plane is dropping out of the sky, And what do? They even woke up one of the pilots. They had 8 minutes to figure it out. None of them figured it out. And all of them died. And that whole aircraft was lost because they didn't have critical thinking. Why didn't they have critical thinking? All of them had drank alcohol within 72 hours. And it turns out it takes 30 days for the brain to fully recover as far as critical thinking is concerned. And so if we want to have the best critical thinking, we're actually going to be teetotalers. Now, in our society today, and this has been talked about on the highest levels, even at the FAA knows this, but they state we can't get this passed that pilots have to be teetotalers because we'd have to fire 80% of our pilots, and there wouldn't be enough pilots to be able to fly around. Now, your pilots are good if they just have to fly from point A to point B and none of the equipment goes bad and they're not in instrument condition. So I don't want to scare you that are into, getting into your next airplane. But if all of those things, this is the perfect storm. When you're in instrument conditions and an instrument goes bad that you're not specifically trained about, you want to be able to have that critical thinking. And this is why it's so important for sometimes even life itself. So once again, 30 days for critical thinking to come back. Nicotine has a more suppressant effect on the frontal lobe. But another area of the brain, or another substance that's more commonly consumed than even alcohol or nicotine is what? Caffeine also has its effect. Caffeine blocks the adenosine receptors in the frontal lobe, and so there is frontal lobe compromise that goes on. How does this manifest itself? One study showed that when you have caffeine on board, you're much more likely to gossip than when caffeine is not on board. And of course, they had to measure what gossiping was. Gossiping is sharing private information with someone who's not part of the problem or part of the solution to the problem. So it's not that you're telling an untruth. You're telling true things, but you're telling it to someone who's not part of the problem or part of the solution to the problem as you talk about somebody else. And studies show you're much more likely to do that under the influence of caffeine. Caffeine does suppress the frontal lobe, that it even makes a difference in some sports. What's the most popular sport in America? Football. And it turns out there's only one player on a football team that requires an intact frontal lobe to be successful. That's the quarterback. Why does he have to have a frontal lobe? He's analyzing information and having to make a decision with that information. And studies show now in quarterbacking that they make far better decisions with zero caffeine. So the quarterback coaches are telling their quarterbacks, get rid of caffeine. By the way, Tom Brady makes it very clear, never utilizes caffeine at all. There's attempted murder going on all around him, and his emotions stay calm, and he makes a wise decision with the ball. It wouldn't happen if caffeine was on board. You'd get a lot more jumpy. This was an interesting study done by Duke University. By the way, on this study on caffeine and gossip, it's kind of interesting that Ellen White talked about that very thing. She said when these tea and coffee users meet together for social entertainment, the effects of their pernicious habit are manifest. All partake freely of their favorite beverages, and as the stimulating influence is felt, notice what happens. Their tongues are loosened, and they begin the wicked work of talking against others. Their words are not few or well chosen. But a lot of people feel it's necessary in their case. Why? Because without it, they're a zombie in the morning, and they need that energy in the morning. Or it's because they have headaches without it. And so they need the vasoconstrictive effect of the caffeine. Measurements showed that caffeine users' post-caffeine levels of alertness were actually no higher than non-caffeine consumers who received a placebo, suggesting caffeine only brings coffee drinkers back up to normal. In other words, all the reported benefits of caffeine are present virtually all day in energy levels only in those who what? Who don't consume it. And so you're getting the pick-me-up because you're under a withdrawal at that point. And so you're just getting rid of the acute effects of withdrawal. And if you got off of it completely, you would actually have the energy level that is far better. But this study was done at Wake Forest University in North Carolina, Paul Laurenti, and there was an ABC reporter that doubted it, and so she came and became a subject after the study. And notice this.
With no caffeine in my system. Then I downed just one drink. Now my second MRI. This was my brain before caffeine. This was after. The difference was remarkable.
It's like a 40% drop in the blood flow to your brain. So that's a lot.
So before caffeine, with caffeine, the blood flow to my brain dropped about 40%.
40%.
Really?
Yeah.
So there's no red flags going off saying don't get into a conversation with your friend, you might gossip. There's nothing like that. You don't really notice it, but when you get the MRI exam, it's very noticeable in regards to what it's doing to the circulation of the frontal lobe. Peter says, gird up the loins of your mind. In other words, let's get our brains as sharp as they can be. Be sober and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. By the way, that word be sober in the Greek means be abstinent. In other words, abstinent from anything that's going to adversely affect our brain's ability. So what does the frontal lobe desire for optimal function? Carbohydrates are used almost exclusively by the brain for optimal function. And of course, the foods that are high in natural carbs are your fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables. That works best for the frontal lobe. Ministry of Healing quotes those 4 food groups and says they impart a strength, a power of endurance, and a vigor of intellect that are not afforded by a more complex and stimulating diet. And it's a diet that we have at Weimar. But since sugar is a carbohydrate, when we first discovered how much carbs are used by the brain, we thought sugar might be helpful, at least some scientists did. And they studied it first in school-age children, and they found out the exact opposite. Large amounts of sugar in the diet actually impair frontal lobe functions in school-age children. And what happens when you have that candy bar is there's a spike in the blood sugar. Our pancreas thinks we've eaten large amounts of fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables, so it cranks out a lot of insulin, and then it plummets, and that plummeting hypoglycemia, even though we put in some mechanisms to prevent it from going down under 50 or 40, the body tries to respond the other way. But once it goes down to subtle hypoglycemia, it'll take 4 hours for the brain to recover. So even after you snack and get the blood sugar back up again, it's still going to impair frontal lobe performance, and it makes about a grade letter difference in school-age children because some subjects require their frontal lobe. Arachidonic acid is also a substance that is like pouring fuel on the fire in regards to inflammation. Depression and anxiety are actually thought of as inflammatory disorders of the brain. And we'll actually measure inflammatory markers when people come through our program. And arachidonic acid decreases the synthesis and storage of acetylcholine, plus it's going to cause some inflammatory effects. This is why in post-traumatic brain injury, we don't want to have arachidonic acid around. And it's present primarily in flesh foods, but it's also present in meat and eggs and fish. It's not present in dairy or any plant foods. And another reason why a more plant-based diet has been shown to be very helpful in randomized controlled trials in regards to optimal mental health. Ellen White said eating much flesh will diminish intellectual activity. Students would accomplish much more in their studies if they never tasted meat. When the animal part of the human nature is strengthened by meat eating, the intellectual power diminishes proportionately. And then there was another interesting study on intelligence by a European journal, the British Medical Journal, and it showed children with high IQs are more likely to become vegetarians when they grow up. So not only becoming plant-based helps your IQ and your EQ, but if you have a high IQ to begin with, you're more likely to go that direction later on in life. A study of more than 8,000 men and women age 30 whose IQs have been measured when they were 10 showed that the higher the IQ at age 10, the greater the odds of becoming a vegetarian by age 30. For each 15-point rise in IQ in the study, the likelihood of becoming a vegetarian rose by 38%. And this was true even after adjusting to factors such as social class and education. The link was still consistent. And of course, this begs the question, why is this happening? You remember the original study on IQ showed that when you have a higher IQ, you're likely to live longer. And they were wondering why that's the case. But when you get a look at the definition of IQ, it shouldn't be a surprise. Do you remember what the definition of IQ is? Your ability to do what? Learn, retain, and apply knowledge. So if you have a high IQ at age 10, you're more likely to learn about the benefits of a plant-based diet. You're more likely to retain it, and you're more likely what? To apply it, and that helps you with your longevity. And so that's the link between high IQ and longevity, is you're more likely to actually apply that knowledge. By the way, often I'm asked to speak in a lot of different sectors that are not at all plant-based or vegetarian, but they're asking me to speak because of the mental health studies and the aspect of that. And I was just over in Washington, D.C. I mentioned in speaking to a group of actually the higher-ups in the Native American world, because there's such a high risk of suicide and depression and those type of things. And there's a Native American embassy that represents the over 100 tribes there. And of course, often when I'm in those environments and I'm eating with them, they'll notice I'm eating differently. And so often the question comes up, oh wow, are you a vegetarian? And so I will say, well, yes, I am. And you know what the next question is? Why are you a vegetarian? Well, as a result of this study, you can just answer it very quickly, high IQ. Actually, that would show low EQ if I said that. So I've been tempted to say that, but I've never actually said that. Physical exercise is also very important for optimal brain function, and studies show getting fit. Actually, as good as exercise is on your body, it's actually even better for your brain. And so being fit is a critical aspect of optimal brain health, but also not just being fit in regards to aerobic exercises, but also working with your hands has been shown to be helpful in intelligence. Working with one's own hands in a real-world 3D environment is imperative for full cognitive and intellectual development. Research is showing that increasing time spent in the virtual world of computers is displacing hands-on play and hands-on learning. 3D learning allows young people to experience how the world works in practice, to gain an understanding of materials and processes, and to make informed judgments about abstract concepts. And of course, one of the big concerns of educators today are, how are most kids learning? On screens. That's two-dimensional. You know, even if you wear your 3D glasses, it's still two-dimensional. That's just fooling yourself that it's actually 3D. And it is a 2D world, and this is actually impairing that full cognitive and intellectual development. This is why I talked about earlier, if you're working with your hands, with flowers, and you're doing things with your hands. In fact, in our Optimize Your Brain class at Weimar, they have to, in order to get an A, they have to work with their hands 20 minutes a day, 6 days a week. And those students that are used to the computerized world before they come to Weimar, they're very kind of perplexed. What am I going to do with my hands for 20 minutes? You know, how can, you know, and of course they're asking, you know, isn't pressing these buttons, 3D? No, not touching the screen is either. And so, we'll tell them, you might want to actually wash your own dishes, or, there's a whole list of items that we give them to do, including some of them like this if they can't find anything else, including playing ping pong, that's at least three-dimensional. Playing a musical instrument, playing a violin is three-dimensional. And so there's a lot of different ways, going out in the garden, the agricultural part of things. I should tell a study of Lance. Lance was one of our challenging students. He was actually not accepted to Weimar, his first application. And I'm not part of the enrollment committee, so I'm not part of that decision-making at all, but it turned out he was known by one of our board members, and so the board member, of course, talked to me when he didn't get accepted. That's often the phone calls I get if people have a connection with Dr. Nedley and their loved one doesn't get into Weimar. I get a phone call. But normally it doesn't change after that because the enrollment committee knows what they're doing. But nonetheless, he was turned down, and one of the reasons why he was turned down was because of the emotional issues that he had. At age 15, he was in a juvenile detention center. At age 16, he went to a place for all boys to try to enhance his brain, but it actually did work. It was, is it Miracle Meadows? One of those, no, it wasn't Miracle Meadows. It was the one that Blondell Sr. would run. Advent Home, yeah. So he was in Advent Home, and there's a lot of working with their hands, and it's really good for ADHD students and things like that, and he began to do better. But one of the reasons he was sent to Advent Home straight from juvenile detention is his mother didn't feel safe with him at home and didn't think she was going to be able to manage him at all. And so with that type of background, he was declined to be admitted to Weimar Institute. But then when the board member told me that he actually did well, and I called Blondell Sr., and Blondell Sr. thought that, he's probably in a position to come there and do well, and he wanted to be a doctor. And, with the challenges he had, that was a pretty significant challenge. So he started taking biology and chemistry his freshman year. He did. I had the enrollment committee review him again, and after with the additional information, they allowed him in. But he was getting like a C in those classes, not anywhere close to being able to get into medical school. But as a result of taking Optimize Your Brain, he learned about this 3D situation, and he said, I want to be transferred to work on the farm. Well, to work on the farm at Weimar, you can't just work 8 hours a week. At Weimar, you have to work, I think, a minimum of 6 or 8 hours a week. That's part of the process of being able to be enhanced as a student, so even all the pre-med students have to do that. And he was working the minimum, and of course they told him, if you work 20 hours a week in agriculture and you're getting a C in things like chemistry and biology, what do you think it's going to be then? And he says, I want to optimize my brain. And he says, I don't know how else to be able to really do it well, and I see the research on working with your hands, I'll work the 20 hours. And so he went out there and worked the 20 hours on the farm, and what do you think happened to his science grades? He was studying less, but they started to improve. And the more he actually worked with chemistry and science, and the more he worked with his hands, it started to get better and better. And now, just last year, he graduated from Loma Linda, and with those original bad grades, they actually, to be safe, they actually put him in a master's program right along with the medical students, and they said, if you can handle this, you're in med school next year. And if you can't, then you'll get your master's degree in science and be able to do other things like that. So I'm not sure where he's at in the process, but it can tell you how different it can be as a result, and there would have been no chance for him to even get into that master's program without that. So back to the pen of inspiration, the sin of intemperate eating, eating too frequently, too much of rich, unwholesome food destroys the healthy action of the digestive organs, affects the brain, and does what? Perverts the judgment, preventing rational, calm, healthy thinking and acting. What area of the brain is this? The rational, calm, healthy thinking and acting. It's the frontal lobe. And the next statement is kind of interesting, and this is a fruitful source of what? Church trials. So the argument in the board meeting may not be due to what you think it's due to. it may be due to what the people ate before they got to the board meeting. And no matter how much you're discussing the subject, there's not enough frontal lobe positivity there going on to be able to think of the things in the principal larger perspective, and thus there is discord even on the church board. A couple of other areas we want to get into before we open it up for questions. Hypnosis is something that is being used in greater frequency today. This comes from a hypnosis textbook that promotes it. Hypnosis attempts by design to what? Cancel out frontal lobe functions and bring people into a trance in which they are what? Highly suggestible. And then it tells you how you can hypnotize people. There's difficult ways and easy ways, but the easiest way is to train the eyes to focus in on what? One object, the best object being a what? Little flickering light. So when the flicker occurs, it's irregular, but your eyes are focused in on it. What will happen? The person will record information and duties without interpretation or without frontal lobe activity. Now, many people may not be aware that they could have a hypnotic instrument in their own room. What trains the eyes to focus in on one object and flickers? And what produces the flicker in entertainment television? It's the scene of reference change. And that's how you can tell true educational versus entertainment TV is by how fast the scene of reference is changing. By the way, news, do you think that's educational or entertainment? It's entertainment because of the rapid scene of reference change that takes place at least in most news programs. And so when that rapid scene of reference changes, and no matter what your favorite television program, even if it seems like a benign television program, within 3 minutes, 90 seconds to 3 minutes, if you're on an EEG, we will see your beta waves drop off within 3 minutes. That means the frontal lobe goes dormant. And the emotions are still working. The memory's working enough that, you know, if you see it a few years later, you recognize it as a rerun, that you've seen it before. But you're no longer critically analyzing the information that comes in. There have been over 3,000 studies done on the effect of entertainment television in the mind. Over 300 books have been written on the subject. And the evidence is very clear on what it does. Increases daydreaming. That's not a good thing. By the way, daydreaming has been, what is daydreaming? Daydreaming is when we are actually going into fantasy world. You know, what would be an example of that? Well, you're going through a line in the grocery store and you see People magazine with maybe Brad Pitt on the cover, and then you imagine that you're Brad Pitt's wife and living in his home or things like that. That's called daydreaming. And daydreaming has actually been shown to be one of the independent variables that increases the risk of dementia later on in life, where creativity does the opposite. And when daydreaming goes up, we'll also see creativity go down. Decrease interest in reading, decrease interest in learning, reduces discernment. It trains you in non-reaction when you should be reacting. It increases aggressiveness when you should not be reacting. It reduces your sensitivity to violence significantly. It's addictive as well. In fact, this was found in the 1970s. Withdrawal symptoms when you quit watching television abruptly. Of course, these are withdrawal symptoms that you can tolerate, or at least, but there will be increased risk of headaches, insomnia, those sorts of things, like getting off another frontal lobe suppressant. The more TV adolescents watch, the more likely they are to develop attention and learning problems and do poorly in school. The amount of TV kids watched when they were 14 was positively linked with having attention problems later, not doing homework, being bored at school, not finishing high school, and hating school, the researchers found. 14-year-olds who added one more daily hour of TV doubled their risk of academic failure at age 16. Just one more hour, you think it's benign, but it's doubling their risk of academic failure. And of course, I know in my own life, I think my life would have been far different had I been raised on entertainment television. My father was wise enough to not have one in the home, and I thought I was being severely mistreated as a result. But then later on, I realized someone else across, I grew up in suburban Detroit, And another individual grew up in downtown Detroit, and his mother got rid of the television when he was in 5th grade, and he was at the bottom of his class having all sorts of emotional problems. And without TV, he began to blossom, and his academic performance went up. And from downtown Detroit to a mother who didn't even know how to read and no father at all, he ended up getting into Yale and then into medical school. And he ended up becoming a creative neurosurgeon who separated the Siamese twins, Ben Carson. And he tells his story. It would have never happened had he had entertainment television in his home after that time. He said it was so wise of his mother. He just credits his mother for getting rid of that TV and getting rid of those screens. And by the way, even in regards to, well, let's talk about this before we close, because the other screens are also an issue. But certainly these screens take away from family achievement and spiritual pursuits, which are also important for the frontal lobe. Ellen White says something, TV wasn't around in her day, but she said something quite profound. There's no influence in our land more powerful to poison the imagination, to destroy religious impressions, and to blunt the relish for the tranquil pleasures and sober realities of life than what? Theatrical amusements. The love for these scenes increases with every indulgence as the desire for intoxicating drink strengthens with its use. The only safe course is to shun the theater, the circus, and every other questionable place of amusement. And then Alvin Toffler, a current media expert, says constant stimulation of the senses shuts down what? The analytical processes. So the constant scene of reference change, then you have the syncopated music that produces its issues, and it ultimately shuts down the ability to do what? Face life rationally. This leads to escape techniques that involve withdrawal, apathy, and rejection of what kind of thinking? Disciplined thinking when faced with difficult duties and decisions. And this is when we need disciplined thinking. This is when problems come into our life. This is the need for disciplined thinking. But yet, when there's a need for disciplined thinking, the typical person that's been constantly stimulating themselves will actually withdraw and reject disciplined thinking, which means they're going to make poor decisions, and it's even going to be a worse situation for them in the long run. And it all starts out by this constant stimulation of the senses. But we thought the solution to no TV was screens that were not television. Digital classroom tools like computers, tablets, and smartphones offer exciting opportunities to deepen learning through creativity, collaboration, and connection, but those very devices can also be distracting to students. Similarly, parents complain that when students are required to complete homework assignments online, it's a challenge for students to remain on task. Like I told you, within 5 minutes, they're no longer going to be doing their homework. And if students don't learn how to concentrate and shut out distractions, research shows they'll have a much harder time succeeding in almost every area of life. And that's because attention is under siege more than it has ever been before. The real message is because attention is under siege more than it's ever been in human history, we have more distractions than ever before. We have to be more what? Focused on cultivating the skills of attention. And if young students don't build up the neural circuitry that focused attention requires, they could have problems controlling their emotions and being empathetic. This is the message from Daniel Goleman, who wrote a book called Focus, the Hidden Driver of Excellence. And he says the circuitry for paying attention is identical for the circuits for managing distressing emotions. The attentional circuitry needs to have the experience of sustained episodes of concentration, reading the text, understanding and listening what the reader is saying in order to build the mental models that create someone who's well educated. And so this is a key component. I told you about that anterior cingulate gyrus. That's the area that you also need to manage distressing emotions. So if you're not able to focus and not able to have good working memory, you're not going to be able to manage your emotions. And this is why people are doing self-mutilation. They're doing all sorts of alternative ways of altering the way they feel so they can take their mind off of their lack of ability to manage their emotions. And of course, that can be reversed and cured as well. So what does Daniel Goleman say? One of the keys to success is a what? Digital Sabbath. Does it say once a week? Every day, sometime when kids, and he also could say adults, aren't being distracted by devices at all and are engaged in focused learning. And of course, the more screen time you have, studies show, the less sleep. And circadian rhythm is an important element, as well as getting enough melatonin at night, which means it's best early to bed, early to rise. That's that nice melatonin peak. And if you delay your bedtime till late at night, you're going to get less of that melatonin peak. And studies have shown sleep is worth far more before than after midnight. 2 hours good sleep before 12 o'clock, worth more than 4 hours after 12 o'clock due to that melatonin output. And then music also has a role to play. I mentioned I was going to talk about this this morning and later on, but music enters the brain through its emotional regions, which include the temporal lobe and limbic system. That type of music that is frontal lobe enhancing has a positive influence on the will, moral worth, and reasoning power. This is a picture that I took when I lived in Oklahoma. I practiced in Ardmore, Oklahoma for 26 years, and that's southern Oklahoma. And so every year I would take our staff down to the Dallas Symphony Christmas concert. And it's kind of interesting in this concert. One of the advantages of being in Dallas, it was the Protestant Mecca of the United States. The Methodists have their headquarters there, the Baptists have their headquarters, there's Baylor, there's all of these other universities. So unlike San Francisco Symphony, which is what I'm close to now, you can go to a Christmas concert there, but they're never going to sing "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." They're not going to sing "Oh Come All Ye Faithful." They might sing "Jingle Bells," but but it's not going to be the actual Christmas story. And the Dallas Symphony, they'll even have one of the singers actually read the account. They won't be reading it, they'll have memorized the account out of Luke. And the orchestra will paint word pictures through that entire thing. It's just very frontal lobe enhancing. And I had one of our newer employees, before I left there, she said, "I'd really like to go. I've never gone to anything like that before." But she said, "My husband's not going to want to go because he's a heavy metalist and he doesn't like classical music and that sort of thing." But one of the things I've learned, and of course I've had a lot of experience dealing with these musical issues through the years, but what I've learned is if it is good frontal lobe enhancing music, everyone's going to be able to enjoy it. It might not be the music they prefer, but they might enjoy it. So I told her that. I said, I can guarantee you that he's going to enjoy at least some aspects of the program. She goes, "I'm glad you told me that. I'm going to tell him that." So he actually came. And he was a big heavy metalist, but after the program, he couldn't quit talking about multiple aspects of that program and how he loved the children's choir and how he loved the angels we have heard on high and those sorts of things. And you could see his engagement in frontal lobe activity occurring and actually improving as a result. Study of 6-year-olds found that those who took music lessons for 1 year scored more points on IQ tests compared with their peers not involved in music classes. The benefit was small. It was seen across the spectrum of abilities measured in the tests, including math, language, and spatial skills. And so one of the characteristics you'll see about a lot of high EQ and IQ individuals was having that musical training, because that music actually enhances all of the areas of the brain. And even the rock and rollers all learn classical music when they're 6 years old. They all learn that aspect of things, which of course includes some brain-enhancing aspects. Other kinds of music will evoke very little, if any, frontal lobe response, will produce a large emotional response with very little logical or moral interpretation. And this is characteristics of the more syncopated rock and roll rhythms that characterize the popular music of the day. And studies are very clear, upbeat music is not necessarily uplifting music. And so it has to do with the characteristics. This study from University of Florida showed that when people are encouraged to reflect on their past, present, and future while listening to classical music, it improves their mood and reduces stress. 6 sessions of classical music therapy were held over a 12-week period in 23 to 45-year-olds. These had never been seriously exposed to classical music. And the subjects showed after just 12 weeks improved scores on tests of overall mood, less depression, less fatigue, and their cortisol levels improved significantly. So there were actually neurohormonal benefits. And when the cortisol goes down, your memory and learning ability actually goes up. This was, again, the pen of inspiration back in 1900 when there was some syncopated rock and roll rhythms coming into the church in Indiana. And Ellen White was shown the things you have described as taking place in Indiana, the Lord has shown me would take place just before the close of probation. Every uncouth thing will be demonstrated. It will be shouting with drums, music, and dancing, and the senses of rational beings will become so confused that they cannot be what? Trusted to do what? Make right decisions. And it's the music behind it that was suppressing the frontal lobe. But she says when this music is played, it will actually be called the moving of the Holy Spirit. But we want the Holy Spirit to enhance the frontal lobe, not detract from it. So what are the characteristics of brains optimizing music? Melodious, it can be simple yet attractive. The consonant harmonies, the dissonant harmonies might be for a transition, but not centering in on the dissonance. Dissonance is also going to produce some adverse effects. And of course, the blue note in jazz is, creating that dissonance. It's called the blue note because it's been shown to induce the blues. And it's quite dissonant music. Straight rhythms or march rhythms as opposed to the syncopated, continual syncopated rhythms. The rhythm less prominent in the melody and harmony, and where the music tells a story, where you can imagine a scene taking place. And it's also enhanced with reverent, uplifting music, where it has that reverential quality, like it enhances us something beyond ourselves. I didn't realize when I scheduled this weekend, I may not have scheduled it the way we did, but I'm glad it worked out, that Weimar Institute was going to be having their Christmas concert this weekend. Since I don't have Dallas Symphony, I go to Weimar Institute, and so they're doing it 3 times in Auburn, and tonight they're doing it at Weimar itself, and then tomorrow they're doing it in another city that's there. But those are the 6 characteristics, and of course this is, I saw in your bulletin, you're going to have Fountain View Academy and Orchestra coming within a few weeks, and when you're at Weimar and you see the college and academy combined and all of that musical talent, it seems like the best of the Fountain View students come to Weimar College, fortunately, and so it's like Fountain View on steroids with all of that. And so I get my own frontal lobe enhanced with that. But these 6 characteristics indeed are powerful. By the way, there's an online thing. I actually saw it. Somebody forwarded me a male chorus in Westminster Abbey recently, "O Love That Will Not Let Me Go." And it had those characteristics there, and it was just, if you can listen to it, very frontal lobe enhancing, pretty exciting. But right underneath that, it was a YouTube, and I do better in listening to the music instead of watching the performance too. So I like to actually just listen to it and not watch the performance. But right underneath that, there was a talk by a musicologist on the transforming power of classical music. And it was a TED Talk, actually, but he was demonstrating with the piano those things and why it actually is transformative in everybody if they engage in it. And he made a very convincing evidence. You guys would very much enjoy it. It's just an 8-minute TED Talk on how some people think only 4% of people are really engaged and really excited about classical music. But he talked about the other 96% in this and how it can actually help their brain as well in regards to engaging. In our program, we actually have people get to the creativity point by the end of the program. Of course, we have a great music person to go through this. I don't teach the music and the music therapy part of our program. One of our music teachers at Weimar College, who's very much into, he can play any type of music, and he's very much into the effects of music. He will actually teach our participants, now that their frontal lobe is enhancing, to be able to write their own songs and utilizing their own life experiences and those sorts of things. And it's very exciting to see the brain wake up with that sort of thing. In regards to our interests, Philippians 4:8 is a good thing even for music. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is worthy of reverence, honorable, seemly, whatever is just, pure, lovely, lovable, whatever is kind and winsome and gracious, if there is any virtue and excellence, anything worthy of praise, think on and weigh and take account of these things. And that's what music is for, to be able to fix our mind on these things. And some of the music today, you just can't call it, no heavy metalist would call their music kind and winsome and gracious. They wouldn't call it lovely or lovable per se. And so some music isn't just going to be able to classify it this way, but if you can indeed accurately classify it this way, it can be a very powerful influence. So in summary, take care of our frontal lobe, protect it from mechanical injury, supply it with good oxygen, good exercise, good deep breathing, get good nutrition, get adequate sunlight. That's also important. The bright light to get serotonin, exercise it just like a muscle. If we don't use it, we're going to lose it. Control the inputs over what we're seeing and hearing and correct distorted thoughts. That also helps our frontal lobe by analyzing our thoughts for distortion and preventing or controlling disease that affects it. There's no better way of exercising than when the people of Acts did. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica, and that they received the word with all what? Readiness of mind, and did what? Search the scriptures weekly, does it say? Daily, whether those things were so. So it was an analytical exercise of searching good spiritual material and enhancing the frontal lobe. So if you want to be more intelligent or more analytical or make better decisions or a greater capacity to empathize with others, better discernment, better reasoning skills, better ability to overcome an addiction, or a greater power to follow your conscience, I'd like you to think about your life and see what you can change habitually to enhance your own frontal lobes. And you will indeed be more open to understanding and doing the will of the Lord as well when that frontal lobe enhances. And of course, there's been people throughout history, including students at Weimar, that are coming out with great frontal lobes. But remember, Daniel and his 3 friends, they made a choice to have different diet than the culture, different entertainment than the culture. And Ellen White, speaking of them, says, "Dear youth, God calls upon you to do a work which through His grace you can do. Show a purity of taste, appetite, and habits that bears comparison with who? Daniel's, and God will reward you," she said, "with 4 things. Calm nerves, clear brain, unimpaired judgment, keen perceptions. The youth of today, whose principles are firm and unwavering, will be blessed, not may be blessed, but will be blessed with what? Health of body, mind, and soul." And fortunately, there are youth taking advantage of that and doing that today. Our brains are built for continual improvement. They're designed that way. And Ellen White says, "The Lord has given man capacity through our brains for continual improvement, has granted him all possible aid in the work. Through the provisions of divine grace, we may attain almost to the excellence of angels." But we do this by following principles. "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God," says Paul, "that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice." Some people would think to live a lifestyle of brain optimization, it would be too much of a sacrifice for them. They may not want to give up this aspect of their diet, or they might not want to give up this substance that they're needing to, quote, feel better, even though it suppresses their frontal lobe, or their entertainment, or their screens. But that's why it says a living sacrifice. You're living, but the sacrifice normally means death. So death to your desires, but put a death to those desires and not practice them, and be acceptable unto God, which Paul doesn't say. Some people would call it extremism. What does Paul call it? He says it's your reasonable service. "Be not conformed to this world, but be ye" what? "Transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And then the wise man in Proverbs says, wisdom is better than rubies. If you have it, a lot of people would go for the rubies before wisdom every time, but that's a big mistake. Wisdom is far better than rubies, and Solomon knew, because he had rubies as well. And all the things that may be desired are not to be compared to it. So no matter what your desires are, if wisdom is not on your top priority list, your desires are, you're having problems with magnification and minimization. You're majoring in minors and minoring in majors. And the number one desire should indeed be wisdom. And that's why we need to not only learn the principles of optimizing our brain, but practice those principles as well. Well, I know you have questions, and I know I would love to answer them, but we do have a closing segment for this section, and I'd like you to consider staying, because often there's a lot of clarifications and a lot of more information that we're able to reveal through your questions. So come on up, and then we'll take the questions thereafter.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nedley. Very inspiring presentation, and we do want to have a question and answer session here momentarily. We want to have an opportunity for anyone here who has questions to be able to take advantage of the fact that Dr. Nedley is here to just take time to answer those questions. Before we do that, we want to do just a little something here. If the deacons would come forward, we're going to take up an offering. Now, this is not an offering that Dr. Nedley has asked for. This is our idea. We would like to take up an offering for the ministries that Dr. Nedley is involved in. He's talked a lot about Weimar Institute and the programs that they have there, the clinical work that's being done there to help people who are struggling. We've heard stories about people like Christy and Jenny and others. We'd like to help these folks by taking up an offering that's specifically for the ministries at Weimar Institute that are designed to help people struggling with issues related to frontal lobe and emotional intelligence and so forth. And so that's what this offering is for. And we just really appreciate everyone that's here and the opportunity that we have right now to contribute to the work that's being done at Weimar Institute. So this is going to be a loose offering, no envelopes involved for this. If you would like to make out a check, because you don't have cash with you or whatever, just make out your check simply to Weimar Institute. That's all that's needed to make a contribution here today. Let's go ahead and pray before we take up the offering. Our Lord in heaven, Lord, we thank you so much just for everything and how you've designed it so perfectly, so wonderfully, and how you've made our brains in a way that we can understand or at least gain a glimpse of how wonderfully our brains and our minds are formed by you. Lord, today we would like to contribute to that, the work that's being done at Weimar Institute. And Lord, all the monies that are given today, we just ask that you would multiply them miraculously to do the work that you want to do for individual lives, for individual people who need you and need the wisdom and understanding of how our minds and bodies work and what we can do just to turn lives around. Lord, thank you for the opportunity we have to give. Thank you for this privilege, and we just thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.